Testing, testing. Testing, testing.
Committee will come to order. Good morning. Today, our committee is honored to welcome United States Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer to testify on President Trump's trade policy agenda. Ambassador Lighthizer, thank you for joining us. We look forward to your testimony. Mr. Ambassador is a former Deputy U.S. Trade Representative under President Reagan and is an experienced trade negotiator. You understand that U.S. leadership and participation in a rules-based trading system is essential to our nation's prosperity. America has led the world in global commerce for the better part of the last 100 years. Through our network of strong, enforceable trade agreements, we've expanded economic freedom so that our businesses, our workers, and our consumers can thrive. Through strict enforcement of the rules we created and our leadership in the World Trade Organization, we've held our competitors accountable. And through our steadfast commitment to the principles of free enterprise, open markets, and rules-based international commerce, our nation has set itself apart. The world looks to us, not China, to lead in setting the standards of global commerce. When we set an example, the world follows. Today, American leadership on trade is more important than ever, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, where China's influence is growing every day. It's urgent that we take charge on trade in the Asia-Pacific so that we don't lose ground to China. After all, to preserve and strengthen America's leadership in global commerce, it's not enough to simply buy American products and services. We also have to sell American. And we need strong trade agreements that allow us to do so in Asia and in fast growth markets throughout the world. Our trade agreements, including NAFTA, have been tremendously successful. They've created American jobs, lowered prices for consumers, and helped our businesses compete and win in all three crucial segments of our economy: agriculture, services, and yes, manufacturing. That said, we have to take action to strengthen our existing agreements to ensure they continue to benefit the American people. I'm pleased that President Trump is taking this approach with NAFTA. NAFTA was negotiated nearly 25 years ago. It should be updated to reflect the modern realities of trade on digital commerce, intellectual property, state-owned enterprises, and customs barriers, among others, following the negotiating objectives Congress set forth in TPA. And as you've committed to us during earlier consultations, Mr. Ambassador, this modernization must be accomplished in a manner that retains current benefits in a seamless way that doesn't disrupt the current agreement, ongoing trade, or the millions of American jobs at stake. With the administration's commitment to our strong, balanced negotiating objectives and deliberate timetable established by TPA, I'm confident we can work together to deliver a high-quality deal for the American people, one that can serve as a model as you move forward with other bilateral agreements. Given that the administration does not support a multilateral approach, we must move quickly together on an ambitious network of deals that break down barriers and allow us to sell American all over the world. I'm particularly interested in TTIP, once the European Union can conclude an ambitious and comprehensive deal. Also, I'm interested in trade agreements with Japan and the United Kingdom when it can come to the table, as well as the trade and services agreement and the environmental goods agreement. And we plan to renew GSP and move quickly on our miscellaneous tariff bill to help U.S. exporters. I'm encouraged to see the President's dedication to strict enforcement of trade rules. The President has already taken important steps by putting into action many new enforcement tools passed by Congress last year. If countries fail to uphold their trade obligations, these powerful tools and our participation in the WTO allow us to challenge them and, if necessary, push back strongly on behalf of our businesses and our workers. And when it comes to America's trade deficit, we welcome the President's efforts to examine the issue. There are, as you know, many factors behind our trade deficit. Some may be related to trade, but many are not. For example, the dollar's status of the world's reserve currency is a significant factor. Examining the trade balance as black or white conceals what's really going on. Many exports from, say, Mexico reflect tremendous U.S. value added through research, development, design, intellectual property, services support, and manufacturing. To the extent the trade deficit is caused by unfair trading practices, we must rip down those barriers. And through our powerful enforcement tools, we can. Another solution is to push for strong trade agreements that open up new markets worldwide for American products and services. Through trade agreements that are strictly enforced, we've reduced and even eliminated trade deficits in manufacturing, agriculture, and services. In many cases, we've even turned deficits into surpluses. While the first instinct may be to restrict imports, history shows that the most successful approach is not protectionism, it's breaking open new markets to American-made goods and services. We have some of the best businesses, workers, and products in the world. If we can reach these customers on a level playing field, America will usually come out on top. That's the recommendation I offer as the administration considers whether to restrict steel and aluminum imports. I agree, we must address market distortions created by China. Section 232 authority must be used with careful consideration of consequences to our economy and trade rules that we wrote and fully expect our trading partners to abide by. Done improperly, we cut off supply that our companies need to stay competitive. Done hastily, we raise costs and prove to our partners that we aren't reliable. Done indiscriminately, we harm countries that trade fairly and send a protectionist signal to those looking for an excuse to do the same. It will encourage others to restrict our exports, even in unrelated sectors, which only hurts the growth of jobs and paychecks here at home. I want to work with the administration to identify a remedy that's balanced, effective, and protects our national security and economic interests. America must continue to set the standards of global commerce. With 96% of the world's customers located outside the United States, we cannot afford to sit on the sidelines, or worse, lead the world into abandoning the very rules that have served us so well. Ambassador Lighthizer, we're eager to work with you and President Trump on a pro-growth trade agenda that creates jobs, grows paychecks, and improves the lives of all Americans. Thank you again, Mr. Ambassador, for being here. We look forward to your testimony. And I now yield to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Neal, for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Lighthizer, I want to welcome you on behalf of the committee Democrats. Today's hearing is an opportunity for us to hear from you about the administration's vision for U.S. trade. The administration has certainly been busy on trade. The headlines these past few months have been filled with stories about modernizing NAFTA, withdrawing from NAFTA, executive orders, executive memos, Section 232 national security reviews on steel and aluminum imports, Canada dairy, Mexican sugar, and U.S. China, and a 100-day plan, and certainly the issue of currency manipulation. What we've been missing in this overall vision, as well as the specifics behind all of it, is activity. What are the administration's trade policy goals? What priorities are you trying to serve? How are you going to do it? And I hope this morning you can provide us with some answers. On a range of issues, there's been a lack of clarity, consistency, and consultation. For example, by statute, the administration was required to submit a report on trade policy and its agenda by March 1st. On that date, the administration instead submitted a statement and promised to submit a full report after USTR was confirmed and had the full opportunity to participate in developing the report. The report has still not been submitted to this Congress. So I hope you will clarify the administration's position on a full range of trade issues today, from specific objectives of a NAFTA rewrite to the administration's position on negotiating TTIP and an environmental goods agreement, to how the administration will address currency manipulation, to the administration's current thinking in steel and aluminum national security investigations as well. As you know, House Democrats have the most open mind when it comes to revisiting and taking new directions in U.S. trade policy. We look forward to working with you to prioritize the needs of American workers and their families through trade policy, and we await your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, and without objection, other members' opening statements will be made a part of the record. Today's sole witness is Ambassador Robert E. Lighthizer, United States Trade Representative. The committee has received your written statement. It will be made part of the formal hearing record. You have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. Ambassador Lighthizer, again, welcome, and you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Brady.
Ambassador, can you check that microphone just to make sure we've got it on? There you go.
Is it better now? Or?
Sir.
All right. Chairman Brady, Ranking Member Neal, members of the Ways and Means Committee, it is an honor to appear before you today. In recent weeks, it has been a pleasure getting to know the chairman, the ranking member, and several members of the committee. I look forward to developing these relationships and to working with each of you. The USTR has a special relationship with this committee, and I intend to continue that tradition. I met some of you for the first time on May 16th when I appeared before the House Advisory Group on Negotiations and the Ways and Means Committee bipartisan meeting. Those consultations are critical to helping the administration establish its negotiating objectives for NAFTA, and more generally, they are helpful for developing trade priorities going forward. To implement this agenda, the President has requested increased funding for USTR in the coming fiscal year. Our budget calls for $57.6 million, an increase of nearly 6% over the 2016 level. These additional resources will be used to implement the Interagency Center on Trade Implementation, Monitoring, and Enforcement, and will allow USTR to hire 8 additional staff to support our trade enforcement activities. The President's budget request is consistent with his desire to control federal spending, as well as his insistence on a strong and aggressive trade policy. Since being sworn in last month, I have been working with our team to advance the President's trade policy. We have been active on the international front with trips to the APEC ministers meeting in Hanoi, a meeting of the OECD in Paris, and a WTO mini-ministerial. At all of these meetings, as well as the numerous bilateral meetings here in Washington, I have conferred with my counterparts from almost every major world economy. In many cases, they have indicated a willingness to work with the United States on efforts to reform the global trading system in ways that will lead to market outcomes that are both fairer and more efficient. We have also reached out to members of this committee, other administration officials, and key stakeholders in an effort to determine what improvements are needed in the international trading system. We are already making progress in 4 vital areas. 1, the President's plan to renegotiate NAFTA. 2, advancing a strong enforcement agenda. 3, opening markets for U.S. exports. And 4, lowering the nation's trade deficit. Let me briefly discuss each of these topics. First, on May 18th, I notified Congress that the President will conduct negotiations with Canada and Mexico in an effort to renegotiate and modernize NAFTA. As you know, the congressional notification is followed by a 90-day period of consultations with the public in Congress. This means that the NAFTA negotiating rounds can begin as soon as August 16th, and we intend to move very quickly. In the meantime, USTR is talking to members, stakeholders, your staffs, and the public to help us develop policy outcomes for the negotiations. We have put out a request for comments and received more than 12,000 responses. We have scheduled hearings for June 27, 28, and 29. During the 90-day period, we will continue working closely with Congress to develop and refine our negotiating objectives. In the interest of a transparent process and as required by TPA, we will be publishing a detailed summary of negotiating objectives on July 17th. Second, we have an aggressive enforcement agenda. We are both defending our rights and holding other countries accountable for their trade violations. For too long, the United States, one of the freest and most open markets in the world, has been the chief target of litigation at the WTO. This makes no sense. At the same time, we are proceeding with several WTO cases, and this is only the beginning. We will aggressively pursue countries that violate trade deals with the United States. We have a number of potential cases under review as I speak. Third, we intend to improve market access for U.S. producers. Let me be very clear on this point. We at USTR want to help every American business that makes a product or provides a service increase exports to the world. Sometimes this requires an enforcement action, other times negotiations are sufficient. The administration is currently engaged with conversations with all of our major trading partners about how to lower barriers that harm U.S. companies, workers, farmers, and ranchers. Finally, we hope that these and other efforts by the Trump administration will help to lower the nation's chronic trade deficit. I understand that many observers believe that we should not concern ourselves with the trade deficit, that this figure is merely a number that reflects macroeconomic factors, not related to trade policy. But the President's view, and mine, is that the trade deficits in the hundreds of billions of dollars that persist for years and years and years, regardless of changes in the broader economy, are indicative of structural problems in global trade.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. That 5 minutes always goes fast. We will, thanks for your testimony. We'll now proceed to the question and answer session. Let me lead off. I want to ask two very basic questions about freedom and leadership. My view is that free trade is economic freedom. It's the freedom to buy and sell and compete around the world with as little government interference as possible. It's the freedom that if you and I build a better product, we should have the freedom to sell it throughout the world. And if someone else builds a better product, we should have the freedom to buy it for our family and for our business. It's really one of the greatest economic rights of every American. So given the choice between more economic freedom and less, we should always choose more. So the question is, will the Trump administration work to expand Americans' economic freedom to trade or ultimately restrict it?
The Trump administration wants to expand economic freedom, wants to expand trade, believes that we can reduce our trade deficits through sales. That certainly is our objective. Philosophically, I would say that the President believes in free trade. He doesn't think that it exists right now. And the question becomes, what do you do to get there? So there are a variety of approaches. I think his approach is to aggressively go after people that are engaging in unfair trade and hope that that leads to market efficiency, more economic freedom, and globally, more wealth.
Thank you, Ambassador. That really steps into leadership. I think the view of many of us is if America doesn't lead in free and fair trade, we'll grow weaker, and our foreign competitors will grow stronger. Our factories and farmers, our technology companies, local businesses will be priced out and shut down around the world. My state of Texas is made for trade. America is made for trade. And that's nowhere more important than in the Asia-Pacific region. It's imperative we continue to communicate to our trading partners and the rest of the world. We're not abandoning the Asia-Pacific region, even though we're no longer part of TPP. This is the reason, one of the reasons that I, along with Ranking Member Neal, Chairman Reichert, and our Senate colleagues introduced a resolution last month expressing our strong support for continued U.S. leadership engagement with other APEC countries. So in the area of leadership, especially in that region, at the end of the day, do you see America's trade values and standards prevailing in that region? Or do you see China's trade values and standards prevailing in that region?
I certainly believe that America's trade values will prevail. I would say in this issue of engagement, I was on the job 4 days when the President sent me off to Hanoi to go to the APEC meeting. I remember bleary-eyed walking around trying to read briefing papers so that I could tell one country from another. But he did that because he wanted to make the point that you're making, that we have to be engaged. These people have to know that we're coming, that we're going to do business, that we're going to sell American products, that we're going to do bilateral agreements, that pulling out of TPP was by no means pulling out of the Asia-Pacific. In fact, to the contrary, the president's view is that we can get better deals on a bilateral basis and engage. In terms of overall whose model works, ours or China's, I mean, that's a very big, very serious question. My belief is that ours is the best and it will prevail. And I believe that a lot of the people in that part of the world are concerned about this question. But the question that I ask is, how do we prove that? We have to take on China when they do things that are inconsistent with our values, with the way we think the economy should develop and work. If you look at it objectively, you would say, for example, in an area like steel, they have now a huge steel industry. None of it's based on economics. And somebody in a country in Asia looking at that might think their system is succeeding and ours is failing. They have 1.1 at least billion tons of steel capacity, and we can't produce 100 million tons. So what we look at, A, I think we're going to prevail. B, I think we have to prevail, not just for our own good, but for the good of the world. The question that I always have, and that I believe the president has, is what do we do to assure that? And that, to me, is taking on China whenever they do something that is inconsistent with not only our model, but their obligations. I apologize for that being too long.
No, Ambassador, thanks for your thoughtful answers. Mr. Neal, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, I'm very interested in TTIP negotiations, which we discussed in my office when you paid a visit. And as we look at the negotiations between the United States and EU, I'm hoping that you can give us an update on the plan. There are 500 million consumers in Europe. They have very similar lifestyle to us. And one of the things that I also found very interesting was I actually suggested to President Obama early on that we juxtapose the two trade agreements, Europe and Asia, that we would have considered Europe first, because I think it would have been much easier to accomplish, and given the fact that there were many prospects of actually doing that, and now to find that the administration, I think, needs to update us on what their plans are for TTIP. I do think it's got an awful lot of potential for America's East Coast if done correctly. And the second question, you perhaps could just answer both. We all read this week about Ford Motor Company deciding to build small cars not in Mexico, but in China, and importing those cars to the United States. That seems to be inconsistent with the president's promise to keep jobs here in America. And with Ford's decision, it also seems to indicate that now China, despite the president's comments during the course of the campaign, is hastening a relationship with automobiles in China. And what we're trying to, I think, to discover this, perhaps with your comments today, does this suggest that for some reason we're focusing more on China than we are on NAFTA?
Mr. Neal, first of all, on TTIP, we certainly agree that that's an important negotiation. For a variety of reasons, it stalled when it did, and this was not a very good year to get it started because of internal European reasons. They had a series of elections which made it difficult to make compromises and to really make an agreement. The final one of those elections is September, and it's in Germany. And then after that, I think we will talk to them. I have certainly met with the Trade Commissioner, Commissioner Malmstrom, and I've talked to her about bilateral issues and cooperating issues, and I'm not here to make any announcement about it, but it is something that we certainly realize the importance of. On the issue of Ford moving a plant, which I saw in the paper also from Mexico to China, I agree with you. I think that is troubling. we don't have an administration position that I've sat in on and talked about at this point, but as the USTR, I find that very troubling. I want to look at and see what the incentives there are. It doesn't necessarily make sense to me. Obviously, it makes sense to Ford, or they wouldn't be doing it. But I think it is incumbent upon us to sit back and look at all the incentives and just figure out exactly why that happened. And if it happened for reasons that are non-economic reasons, then I think the administration should take action. In terms of the president's relationship to the Ford move, I guess I'm reminded of a quote in the back of Profiles in Courage, where when he's sort of taking little quips, and he says that a congressman once wrote in the 30s that one of the problems with being elected to Congress was that, this is in response to a constituent letter, he said, is that I get letters from people like you who say that I ran for Congress based on reforesting the Sahara Nevada mountains. I've been in office 6 weeks and I haven't gotten it done. Sorry, can't help, or something like that. So I guess that's a long way of saying I think it's probably early to say that the president's policies are responsible for Ford doing whatever it is that it's doing. But I think it's something we have to look at. We have to look at incentives, and it was as troubling to me as it was to you.
I thank you. And Mr. Ambassador, I hope that you might inform the committee of the administration's position as promptly as you can on that issue. I hope that you can inform the committee promptly on your position and the administration's position on that issue of those cars being manufactured in China.
I will undertake that, and I appreciate that question. I will use that as a mandate to develop a position and report it to you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Mr. Nunes, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, I have three topics I want to cover with you, try to get through all three of them quickly here. The first is NAFTA. I think we're all for looking at ways to improve NAFTA. However, as you know, with all negotiated trade, with every action becomes a reaction. And so there could be a reaction from our allies and our partners, trading partners. Agriculture specifically, as you know, the United States produces more food than we can consume. And I am worried about any type of retribution that either Mexico or Canada could take on our U.S. farmers. And so I know you're aware of this, but I wanted to just get your thoughts on ensuring that we protect agriculture in these upcoming negotiations on NAFTA.
Congressman, that's very important. I've testified on this before. We realize there have been winners and there have been losers in the NAFTA process as it's developed over these 23 years, 25 years since the negotiations themselves began. Agriculture has been a winner. I would say, even with that, I would drop a footnote down and say that although we do have a $4.7 billion deficit even in agriculture, but it's not for the kind of products that you were thinking about. And it is very important that we do no harm. So our very high priority will be making sure that we do not disrupt our sales in agricultural products to either Canada or Mexico, but presumably you're mostly thinking about Mexico. And that is a problem. It's a legitimate worry. It's something we're worried about and very concerned about.
Yeah, and there's no question that Canada could do a lot more to open up their trading practices for our agricultural products. If I could, I'd like to move to India. I think you and I share, and the administration share the goal of enhancing our partnership with India, the world's largest democracy. They've made a lot of growth over the years, but they've continued to have trading practices that make it hard for us to actually get to the table with each other. And one of those issues that I want to make sure that maybe you can just to bring to your attention in case you're not aware of it, and maybe you can come back to us just for the record, but specifically with almonds and other types of walnuts and pistachios, there continues to be problems with moving those products to India. And I'm not going to ask you to be an expert on specific products, but if you could come back to us with a report on India's different potential problems that they're creating with these trade practices, I'd appreciate it.
I will certainly do that, and with the Prime Minister coming to Washington, this is an opportune time to do that. I have raised the the almond issue with with the Indians. So it's clearly something that we're concerned about. And part of my response always is, look at with the size of the trade surplus you have with the United States, you ought to be looking for things to buy to get that trade deficit down. And that's one of the ways we're trying to help America export.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. I appreciate that comment. Finally, I want to just explore a little bit. There's been a lot of debate about whether or not our tax system needs to have a border adjustment. As you know, 150 countries around the world border adjust. And I just find it hard to believe in the long run how we're going to be competitive if everything that we export to most of our trading partners has anywhere from a 15 to 25% VAT put on top of those products. And then, of course, anything that we import doesn't pay the VAT in their country. And I'm not asking you to wade into whether or not you support or oppose border adjustment, but I'd be interested in your thoughts as to how we can fix these discrepancies with these countries that border adjust.
Well, thank you, Congressman. I have, from time to time, written op-eds and the like on this subject. It is troubling to me. I am, first of all, I'm not the Treasury Secretary, mercifully, so I don't have to worry about negotiating a tax deal, and I don't envy any member of the committee who has that ahead of them as we go forward. But I do agree that value-added tax create an unfair advantage, and there's been a clear migration throughout the world from income taxes to value-added taxes precisely for that reason. So I don't agree with people who say it doesn't make any difference. I think that it does make a difference. That isn't to say I'm endorsing any particular solution or anything like that, but I'm sympathetic to the problem, and I think it has an impact on exports. I think it has an impact on manufacturing and competitiveness in America. So it's a major issue.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. My time has expired. The chairman's going to gavel down, but thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Levin, you're recognized.
Welcome. Hi. NAFTA became very much involved in controversy mainly because of the lack of enforceable labor and environmental provisions. The auto sector is a major source of the trade deficit. So let me just review a few facts and ask you some questions. In the last decade or two, the employment in the Mexican auto sector has gone up over 200,000 people, while in the U.S. it's dropped 90,000, really more than that if you go back over a decade. And in terms of competition, Mexican workers in the auto industry are paid 19% of what are paid in the big three, and the president called Mexican factories sweatshops. And that's further evidence that auto worker wages in Mexico went down 20%, though productivity went up 80%. And sweatshops, that's correct, because workers in the auto industry in Mexico cannot form unions. There are sham outfits. So let me ask you three questions, if I might, relating to it. First, do you agree that depressed wages in Mexico are leading to negative wage pressure and job loss in the United States? If so, can any renegotiation of NAFTA truly promote jobs here in the U.S. without addressing labor rights in Mexico? Two, with that in mind, can you tell us what specific proposals the administration is considering to require Mexico to change its laws and practices relating to labor rights as a way to create and safeguard jobs in the U.S.? And number three, I take it on this you're the lead person in the administration, though that isn't always clear, but I assume you will be and hope you will be. Will the administration insist that Mexico bring its labor laws and practices into compliance with basic labor standards before Congress is asked to vote on a renegotiated NAFTA agreement? So fire away.
Yes.
Since I did.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. First of all, do I believe that Mexican labor laws are having a negative effect on the U.S.? Yes, I believe that. And I believe if we're going to get the deficit down and we're going to have an appropriate agreement and one that will pass, it will have to have an effect on that. I do believe, though, that the Mexican government itself understands that there's a problem here, and I think they're taking steps, which is a good sign. But I'm not suggesting that.
You need to talk further about that, but keep going.
With respect to what our specific proposals are, we're still in the process of talking to stakeholders in the Congress, and we're interested in people's views. We do believe you have to have basic ILO core standards, and we believe that they have to be enforceable, just like we believe that every provision in the agreement has to be enforceable. Do I believe there should be a commitment and proof before a vote? No, I don't. I think we're going to put together an agreement. We're going to come forward. It's going to be the best agreement we can have, and in the final analysis, the United States Congress will rule on whether it's a sufficiently good agreement, and I don't think there'll be preconditions like this.
Okay, I think unless practice has shown that changes are made before we vote both in laws and practices, that essentially it will be difficult and should be difficult to pass NAFTA. We insisted with Peru that they change their laws and practices before we voted on it. May 10th was a major breakthrough, but unless it was made real before we voted, it was impossible to vote for it. And time has shown with Colombia and other countries that if you don't have that standard, you chase enforcement everywhere. So we're going to be very emphatic about that. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Mr. Teeberry, you're recognized.
Thank you, Ambassador, for being here. I know that you know that the volume, the complexity, the challenges of trade have only grown over the years. I want to associate myself with what Mr. Nunes said with respect to NAFTA and agriculture. In Ohio, my home state, Canada is our #1 trading partner, and agriculture is our #1 issue and #1 job, economic driver. But Mr. Ambassador, I want to focus on our trade agreement with Korea. We have seen an influx of imports of oil, country, tubular goods, OCTG, from the Republic of Korea. In 2015, Congress gave the Department of Commerce new authority to address market distortions in the production of foreign merchandise and to calculate dumping margins that more accurately account for the unfair pricing practices of foreign exports. Can you commit to this committee that you will make it a priority of this administration to engage with our trading partners, particularly in this case, Korea, the Republic of Korea, who continue to dump these products into our country?
Yes.
Thank you. Certainly appreciate that. The other issue the chairman mentioned that I want to comment on is our ongoing Section 232 investigation on national security implications of steel and aluminum imports. And I, again, want to applaud and say I appreciate the administration's commitment to America's security and ensuring a level playing field with our trading partners. However, I've heard from a number of employers in my district, manufacturers, about the potential that some of our trading partners could misuse national security justifications to have retaliatory and protectionist actions taken against them. Are you at all concerned about the potential for retaliation by some of our trading partners and the effect it would have on domestic manufacturers?
Yes, we are concerned. Although we start with the proposition that we have a global, extraordinary excess amount of capacity that is basically created by China, and then we can talk about some other potential problems, but we have this 1.1 or more billion tons, which I mentioned before, and the question becomes, how do you deal with that, right? You can't deal with it just at the border with China, because it's not that kind of a problem. They're sending it everywhere in the world. And as you said in your first question, they're sending it to Korea, who's then sending it to us in the form of OCTG. So it's a huge problem. Given that problem, it's reasonable to sit back and say, what are all of the possible tools we have? And one of the tools we have is 232, because it does have a national security effect that's quite significant. Now, there is the response, one, of retaliation. We're always worried about retaliation. But if we don't defend ourselves because of a fear of retaliation, then we are just going to be the residual of what nobody else wants. So we can't let unfair trade go forward just for that reason, but it certainly is a reasonable thing to think about and try to control. So I don't disagree with that at all. The argument that, well, other people will use their national security exemption for ways that are really hidden protectionism, that's also a concern, something we have to think about. But I'm inclined to believe personally that with respect to a lot of these countries, they'll use every tool they have right now to defend their interests and to take advantage of our market. So I'm kind of less persuaded by that argument, although I think it's a legitimate argument, something we have to be concerned about. But I think we do have an obligation to all Americans when you see something that's very bad going on. We have a kind of a contract with all of our workers and all of our farmers that we are going to defend America, or free trade doesn't mean anything. I think every member of this committee agrees with that. And this is one of the tools that it's legitimate to look at and to use in that context.
I certainly appreciate it. I certainly appreciate your work, your expertise on this issue. I just would hope that you and your team would clearly review the chairman's opening statement, because I think it reflects on this side of the aisle some concern about the balance in this area. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. T. Berry. Mr. Doggett, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador. You have been a personal longtime critic of WTO dispute panels overreaching and effectively declaring new obligations and undermining our democratic processes. Under NAFTA, the investor state dispute settlement procedures, with which you're very familiar, the ISDS, permit 3 private attorneys whose decisions are not subject to appeal to effectively create new obligations and commit unlimited amounts of taxpayer funds to foreign corporations for claim violations. Yesterday at the Finance Committee, you testified concerning your concerns about ISDS. You're aware that the National Association of Attorneys General, the National Conference of State Legislatures have objected to ISDS, that recently the American Automotive Policy Council, our major manufacturers, said that, quote, ISDS provisions in NAFTA, or an ISDS provision in NAFTA is unnecessary. Do you agree with them?
I'm sorry.
Do you agree, without reading it, do you agree that ISDS is unnecessary in NAFTA?
I think ISDS is something that we have to discuss and be informed more by the members. So I won't take a final position right now. I would say this: it clearly is a balance. There is a legitimate interest in people who go overseas and invest, and the United States has an obligation to do what it can to make sure that those people are treated fairly. On the other hand, as you suggest, Congressman, I am troubled by the sovereignty issue. I'm troubled by the fact that anyone can overrule the United States Congress and the President of the United States when it's passed a law. That is troubling to me. So trying to balance those two things is something that I really want to kind of work through and be informed by the members' views.
Certainly we do want to see our investors protected wherever they are. And Canada has a mature court system. There are a few more challenges in Mexico, but I hope you will be looking closely at a system that I think has failed us. And a second area, you say in your testimony, and I was pleased to hear it, that you expect significant action far beyond previous administrations, including, for example, self-initiated litigation in defense of U.S. workers. While that's good, it's a fairly low bar, since USTR, under all previous administrations, I think has never successfully challenged a labor or environmental provision with any trading partner. And as you know, yesterday, the United States lost in its drug-out lengthy 9-year action with reference to Guatemala labor, with a finding apparently that it was not a manner affecting trade. I believe that the failure to effectively enforce our environmental and working condition provisions is one of the reasons many of us did not have confidence in the TPP or in other recent agreements, that the comments about labor and environment were really meaningless. Given the short time, I would just ask you to respond in writing as to whether you consider artificially suppressed wages to be a subsidy, and whether these subsidies impact trade between countries, to tell us how this decision may affect the need for changes in the NAFTA agreement with reference to workers. Similarly, with Peru, they're both labor complaints on which there are provisions that have not been enforced, and I would ask you to respond concerning the complaint filed in 2015 on Peru labor, concerning the fact that they were effectively denying improved wages and conditions in Peru, and also in Peru on the environmental provision, that about 90% of all timber leaving Peru was harvested illegally when we set up the agreement, and it still is. And if you believe that Peru is in compliance with its environmental obligations under the Forest Annex, and why there have been no audits of producers and exporters. And I'll submit others concerning all the pending enforcement actions on which we see really no effective enforcement. Finally, you've got 500 advisors on trade agreements, corporate advisors. When will the members of Congress be able to see the specific language that USTR proposes to Mexico and Canada on NAFTA changes?
Well, in the first place, we will submit an answer in writing as you requested, Congressman. In terms of the language, we have an agreement with the chairman. We expect to be very transparent. We're going to follow the TPA to the letter. I realize that in the past there have been issues about whether or not the Congress has had adequate access to text, and I think I'm in agreement with the chairman. We have a plan. I expect to follow that plan and make that text available, and I expect the chairman to instantly tell me when I haven't followed the plan, which, if it happens, will only be by accident.
Could you disclose what the plan is?
Thank you. We are in discussions with our ranking member on this important issue. We agree with you, Mr. Doggett, about the access to text. So thank you, Ambassador. I'll let you run a little long there. Mr. Reichert, Chairman of the Trade Subcommittee, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador. Every member on this panel will tell you that trade is critical to their home state, and I'm here to tell you that's true of Washington State. Apple growers export 1/3 of their crop each year. State Services exports over $26 billion a year, and the jobs in Washington supported by exports, over 90% depend on manufacturers selling their world-class products across the globe. But Washington's workers, farmers, and businesses cannot be left behind as other countries race to establish strong bilateral and regional agreements that carve us out. So while we work to update NAFTA, we must begin to put other negotiations in the pipeline. So I'm an old career law enforcement retired. I get the enforcement piece, but there's always community outreach. In my view, the TPP countries have been now left hanging. And frankly, I was disappointed, but encouraged that the President wants to go bilateral agreements. I'm on board with that and ready to go. As you know, we've had a chance to visit. But I think there has to be an aggressive, energetic outreach to these countries. And in my question is, beyond Canada and Mexico, which countries, regions, and/or sectors are priorities for the Trump administration? What's the next step after NAFTA?
Well, thank you, Congressman. We are still in the process of developing those priorities and that list. First, I would say that the President is very pro-trade. Secondly, that we, as you say, our objective is to have bilateral agreements and a series of them. And we think we can do that using model agreements and do it effectively and have agreements which are better for American workers and American apple growers and others. In terms of what specific countries we would go to, there are a lot that are on the table. Obviously, there's TTIP, which has been mentioned. There's a lot of people who believe that we have to go up to the TPP countries and start negotiating those. And of course, foremost among those, in some people's opinion, is Japan. So that's something we have to think about now.
But you're in communication with those TPP countries.
We are in community. I've met with several of them. And there are a variety of issues in various places, and the Japanese, my guess is right now, are not ready to do a bilateral agreement with the United States. But these things are all developing. We're in discussions.
So after NAFTA, you're still considering TTIP, or Japan, or UK.
The UK is another option. So these are things, but I do think there's a lot of pressure to move into the direction where the TPP would have filled a gap and to go in there. And my instinct is that members of Congress also would feel comfortable if we started doing that. So I think there are a lot of reasons to militate in that direction. But the other thing is it does take two to tango. So we have to kind of develop this.
I want to be engaged with you on that. I'm sure other members of the committee do. How do you see the bilateral agreements coming together to create the high standards throughout the world? That's been touched on by a couple of members. And just my personal experience with one country, Mr. Tiberi mentioned South Korea. In my discussions with assemblymen and women in South Korea, and asking them the question, after the Korean agreement was finalized, what was their opinion as far as the impact it had on China? And their first response was China should start to pay attention because high standards now are in the region and will be developing. Of course, back then TPP was the thing that people were looking to. So that one agreement with Korea made an impact on that region. And so again, emphasizing the need to reach out to those countries, TPP countries, strengthening that position of strong standards. How do you see a bilateral agreement with Japan, for example, or others, strengthening that standard, our standards, throughout that region and the world?
Well, I would say, first of all, I don't want to suggest that we're going to have a bilateral agreement at this time with Japan. That's something that they're looking at and that we're looking at and all that sort of thing. But I certainly agree with the chairman's basic point at the very beginning, which you have also endorsed, which is that the United States moves in. We have an agreement that's a high standards agreement. In many cases, on a bilateral basis, you can have higher standards because that country that you're negotiating with may not have a particular problem in an area where you can get a high standard. A good example of that would be currency. If you're negotiating with someone who really isn't a currency manipulator, it's easier to get to a high standard on currency and then set the standard. So there are a lot of things that can be done like that. But I think having those kinds of agreements does push back against China, does change the standards, and does have people realize the United States is engaged in it, and it has a ripple effect throughout the region. So I completely endorse the point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for being here. The priorities for our trade policy must be to support and help create good American jobs, grow the economy, set basic standards for our partners to live up to, improve market access, and protect the labor rights and the environment. And I think that Congress has an important role in this, and I value the opportunity to work with you to make sure that this happens. In increasing exports and eliminating trade barriers can really be a win for our economy, provided that the playing field is level and everyone operates under a fair and basic set of rules, and that those rules are enforced. So I want to, in that regard, I want to associate myself with the ag comments that have been made by a couple of my colleagues on the dais. And I also want to associate myself with something that Mr. Doggett said when he asked if you thought that wages, suppressed wages in other countries, are a subsidy to manufacturers in those other countries. And I would ask similarly, do poor environmental rules equal a subsidy to producers in other countries?
Let me say, first of all, that I think low labor standards are an unfair advantage to someone with whom we're dealing. Whether it's technically a subsidy under the countervailing duty laws is not something that I'm addressing right now here in this case. So I don't want there to be any misunderstanding. The same thing is true with respect to the environment. But I think it is, I look at it the other way. I think it is wrong in the Ricardian way we think about these things to have some things be a legitimate competitive advantage. And to me, environmental pollution shouldn't be, it's not a legitimate competitive advantage in the way we analyze trade, because at a level we're all really free traders. We all have the same objective. The question is, how do we get there? So I look at it the other way around. I think it is not a legitimate competitive advantage to have very low environmental standards. So that's why I'm troubled by it. And I think the same thing is also true with respect to labor standards.
Well, I certainly know in my business, if I didn't have to pay attention to regulations and rules, and particularly with environmental standards, I could make a lot more money than I do. And that would put me at a competitive advantage over someone who had to do that. The U.S. wine exporters continue to face highly burdensome trade barriers in Canada. British Columbia has a very discriminatory grocery store program that prohibits American wine from being sold on the same shelves as domestic wine, giving the BC producers an enormous competitive advantage. In January of 2017, USTR requested WTO dispute settlement consultations with Canada on this matter, but the consultations failed to bring about any grocery access for American winemakers. Given Canada's continued refusal to modify its discriminatory program in any way, will USTR now work to fully enforce U.S. rights under the WTO agreement and formally request a dispute settlement panel?
First of all, Congressman, I'm of course very much aware of this problem. I completely agree with the sentiment of your question. Whether we go to the panel stage is something that's under review right now. You can take from my general attitude that I'm very pro-enforcement. The only caveat I would add is this something that you're better off dealing with in a NAFTA negotiation? So I think we have to think about that. The stakeholders have to think about it. The members have to think about it. And I have to be informed by all of you. But it's a very serious problem. It's the kind of problem that ought to be brought to a panel, in my opinion, if it can't otherwise be resolved. The only thing I would say is we have to think about whether this belongs in the NAFTA context, in which case it would make more sense to negotiate it and do it in a less kind of hostile way. But it's a major problem, and it's an extraordinary problem for those people who are affected, those producers, and there's no justification for it.
So in modernizing NAFTA, is this something, the elimination of this discriminatory practice, we could see as a possibility?
It certainly is something that we're going to raise and deal with one way or the other.
It was said that if TTP fails, that it would give China an upper hand. How much time do you think we have to address that before they do, in fact, have an upper hand?
Do I have... I'm minus 7 seconds.
You are, Mr. Baxter. I'm afraid we'll have to come back to you on that question.
I'm sorry, sir.
No, thank you. Mr. Buchanan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the ambassador. I know all of us look forward to working with you going forward. Just a couple of points from Florida. We have 14 ports. 1 in 5 jobs in Florida are tied to trade, so trade is a big opportunity for us. But I believe, I'm a free trader, but I think trade needs to be a win-win. I am concerned, especially with some of the bigger countries with large trade imbalances. I think it's something we need to look at. I'm sure you will. But I think on some of our trade agreements over the years, we've been played. That's just my opinion, and that's something we can talk about further going forward. I wanted to drill down a little bit on Florida issue in terms of NAFTA. We are the second largest state in terms of fruits and vegetables grown. We have pretty much the same growing season as Mexico. It's a $12 billion industry, but a lot of people feel because of some of the techniques, the anti-dumping and other things that are going into Florida, it's cost us about $1 to $3 billion in terms of Florida's opportunities down there, and a lot of jobs. And I just wanted to get your thoughts, if that's on your radar, something you're looking at. Mexico's next to us, a good neighbor, but we want to make sure it's fair.
Well, I would say that I completely agree with you. I'm familiar with the issue. I'm not as familiar, obviously, as you are. I've talked to the governor about it, who's raised this issue a lot. When I say we have a trade deficit in agriculture with Mexico, what we're talking about is the problem that you raised, because with respect to everything else, we have a surplus. So I think it is something that we have to work on. I'd be happy to work with you on it. It's something that we ought to be talking about in the NAFTA context, and then there are issues of whether or not there's unfair trade involved here. There's a lot of things we have to consider, but I realize it's an acute problem, and it's become more and more acute, and it's really something that I want to engage on.
Well, I'd appreciate the opportunity to work with you going forward. I want to talk, Mr. Neal had brought this up about TTIP. It sure seems to me that, and I've had the opportunity to travel in Europe, met with a lot of American businesses in Europe. It makes a lot of sense. We have a lot of same shared values. When you look at labor rates, a lot of it's fairly competitive, comparable sized markets in terms of the EU. And I know that the last administration, because I've met with several of folks in your office back a couple of years ago, where there's been a lot of work product and a lot of effort that's been done. I know there's a lot of individual issues with various countries, but what's your sense of where that's at today? Or is that something we can resurrect? Or do you just see that we're going to move forward on a bilateral agreement with every single country individually, which would take a long time to get anything done? But I wanted to get your comments on it.
Well, first of all, it is something that the president has spoken on. He spoke with, he mentioned it during his meeting with Chancellor Merkel some months ago. It's something we're looking at. We're reviewing all of these agreements, so I don't want to prejudge it, but it is clearly something that I understand there's a lot of momentum behind. There are a lot of reasons to do it. On the other hand, it wasn't accomplished, so there are obviously problems, or it would have been done, and we wouldn't be talking about it at this point. It's in the group of things that we are going to review, agreements that we are in the process right now of reviewing and decide where to allocate our resources. There are a lot of arguments against it, but as I say, if it was so close to being done, it would be done, and we wouldn't have to worry about it. Right now, it can't be done because of the political situation.
Let me just throw this out. I've watched, being in Congress for 10 years, I've watched trying to get agreements done. It seems like forever. So when you go at it just on a bilateral basis, and there's probably reasons strategically to do some countries that way, but it seems like there's been a lot of work product in terms of the EU. Because of shared values, it makes some sense to see if there's not an opportunity to do something in a big way that would impact, and I know it's not easy because there are a lot of issues with individual countries in Europe, but I'd be interested in you guys being open-minded to that as a possibility.
Thank you, sir. And we are. It's under review, and I could make an argument if I had to that it's a bilateral agreement. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Lewis, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing today. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being here. I would like for you to give me some idea when it comes to trade policy. What is your position on the issues of human rights, labor rights, protecting the environment? It is my belief that a trade policy should be a reflection of our own values. I'd just like to hear you out.
Well, I think that's a very important point. I think it's not really fundamentally different than the point that the chairman made. I mean, we have a system, and we're proud of that system, and the system has created an enormous amount of good for not just Americans, but for people around the world. In terms of and we have an obligation to push that forward. To be honest, personally, I view myself as worrying about the dollars and cents part of it. I'm not worried about the foreign policy part of it or the...
So are you suggesting, Mr. Ambassador, that we make money, we get the dollar at any cost?
No, I think.
But you said you're concerned about the dollar.
No, I don't think that's right. First place, I don't believe that at all. In the second place, I view my focus has to be on trade and economics. That's really what I'm paid to do. That isn't to say that the other things aren't even more important, but my focus is. But where we overlap, Congressman, is I think that labor and the environment are economic issues, and I approach them as economic issues. That's how I think of them. I think the United States, and many of the members have said this, the United States, every businessman, every farmer, every worker has a right to get a fair shake both in their own market, and we have to remember that. This is not just about exports. We have a right to have a fair, we have a contract with these people where we will pursue a certain economic policy, which we all think is the right policy, which makes everybody richer. But the part of that contract is that we will give them all a fair break. And that means fair competition in their own market and overseas. And part of that fair competition, in my judgment, are things like labor rights overseas and the environment. Now, that isn't to say that I think you want to ratchet up or do any of those things. I'm just saying there are certain minimum standards that are part of our system. And to fall below that is an economic advantage, which I don't think is a fair advantage. So I don't disagree with your premise. I'm just saying I'm worried about the economic side of it. I'm worried about workers and farmers making more money at the end of the day. And the other things are important, but they're not my focus.
But you're not prepared to commit to me, to this one member, that our trade policy should be a reflection of our values as a country. We can't say one thing at home and do something else abroad.
I think it should be a reflection of our values.
Well, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Mr. Roscom, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, thank you very much for your time today. Just to shift gears a little bit, one of the big priorities is our relationship with Israel historically, and back in the last Congress, we overwhelmingly passed into TPA. One of the stated trade objectives of the United States is to push back against the BDS movement, the anti-Israel boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And this is into a larger context. The former ambassador from Israel to the United States, Michael Oren, wrote an op-ed in which he, a few years ago, he made this point. He said the first wave of anti-Israeli activity was military, and we know how that turned out. The second wave was the terror movement against Israel. But the third wave is, in some ways, more insidious in that it is trying to take away Israel's legitimacy and therefore just simply remove it from the world stage. So one of the tools that you have as the trade ambassador is the capacity to push back against that, particularly as it relates to European governmental actors. Can you just give us a sense of where that stands and how the administration is adopting that TPA objective?
Well, right now we're not in negotiations with Europe. So, but we understand that's an objective, and indeed, I would say it's a threshold. It's more than an objective. I think that I shouldn't speak for the administration on matters of foreign policy, but on this one, I think it is so clear. The administration is very strongly agrees with that sentiment. And we think that these boycotts and divestitures and are very dangerous. They're not just dangerous for Israel; they're dangerous as a precedent for the whole economic system. So, personally, I'm very sympathetic. I believe the president is very sympathetic, and that will be a very important objective when we get to the point that we're talking to Israel. That we're talking to Europe about TTIP or other agreements.
Very good. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Larson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador. In my state of Connecticut, we have a great deal of exports. In fact, nearly 6,000 companies in Connecticut are involved in exporting, and nearly 90% of them are small businesses. That is why we believe it's critical to ensure our businesses and our workers maintain their economic and competitive position in the international markets. I know you understand this thoroughly. I know you also understand that many American workers feel that the international trade has eroded the middle-class wages and led to job losses. You can hear in some of the sentiments that are asked and the questions that a number of our members are asking. So that means that enforcement of labor and environmental provisions in our existing agreements and insisting on strong protections in any future agreements is essential. I know you understand that. But what I have, and there's not enough time for me, but I want to pose 6 questions with the permission of the chair. If I could pose the questions and then have them in writing, those that, because I don't believe the ambassador would be fair to him, but at least he'll get the gist, and then we can further correspond beyond the committee, and I won't supersede the time that I've been allotted. The first is with regard to NAFTA. How do you plan to seek greater access to the Canadian and Mexican procurement markets while protecting our own Buy American priorities? These seem to be in conflict, and so what specific changes will you seek to the government procurement chapter of NAFTA? That would be question number 1. What kind of enhancements with regard to NAFTA, with respect to intellectual property protection, is the administration contemplating in the NAFTA rewrite? Thirdly, what is your plan when it comes to the enforcement of labor and environmental provisions in our future FTAs? The fourth has to deal with currency that a number of people have discussed and you've raised here. Is what is the administration's intention with respect to seeking the inclusion of currency rules in its trade agreements? You have already elaborated on standards and the need for those. And again, I would appreciate if you could respond to that. With regard to further in that regard, do you support including strong and enforceable disciplines in NAFTA and other trade agreements? And finally, Mr. Ambassador, we are very concerned about the issue that was raised when the President said that he might terminate the U.S.-Korea free trade agreement. What are the administration's plans with respect to the U.S.-Korea trade agreement? And if you could answer that, that would be great.
So I'm going to put 6 in the record and answer the last one.
Yes.
We are looking at all of our trade agreements, and the chorus is one of them that we're looking at very closely. There have been winners and there have been losers. I would be perfectly candid if I would be less than candid if I didn't say it's troubling to me the direction the trade deficit has gone with respect to that agreement. It's had a negative effect on the U.S. Trade balance. Having said that, it's just in the group that we're looking at. There are no plans to drop out of chorus at this point. It's just something that we're talking to the Koreans. I have to have a meeting today or tomorrow with the Koreans on these issues. We have a variety of thorny issues that we think are costing us exports, and those things are all we're going to raise, and it fits into that category of things that I say, if you have a big trade surplus with the United States, you'd better get rid of the barriers to our exports to you, and it fits into that category of things, and I'm going right down the line insisting with these people that you can't have barriers to trade and have a $20 or $30 billion surplus to us. You had better get rid of the barriers and let us sell there, because we're not going to tolerate it anymore. But in terms of a plan right now to get out of course, no, there's no such plan, but it's under review. It's seriously being looked at, and the President is troubled by the trade balance.
That's reassuring, certainly to hear. I know a number of people over the recess will be traveling to Korea for a variety of purposes, not the least of which is national security. So I do think it's important that that message be reinforced, and I couldn't agree with you more in terms of the trade imbalance. So I commend you in that areas, and also for the encouragement that we're not going to be dropping out of chorus. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. You may have set a record for a number of questions stuffed into a 5-minute period. Thank you. Mr. Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, for your service and for sharing your time here today. I certainly want to associate my comments and concerns with my colleagues who have raised the issue of agriculture and NAFTA and the progress that has been made with NAFTA. I know producers across rural Nebraska certainly appreciate the gains that have been made, and I think you've heard from us numerous times. We call us the agriculture delegation here on the committee. You've heard us mention and emphasize several times how important these issues are, agriculture issues, that we not undermine the successes that NAFTA has brought to U.S. agriculture. Shifting gears just a bit, thank you for the work that you and the President and others in the administration have done on pressing China on a number of trade issues. This isn't just a market access issue for the biotech firms. The lack of approval for these products also forces U.S. producers to choose between the most current seed varieties or continuing access to China's 1.3 billion consumers, and it's obviously a big deal. As agreed to under U.S.-China 100-day plan, China's National Biosafety Committee, or the NBC, recently met to review approval petitions for 8 U.S. biotech products, which have seen their approval for the Chinese market delayed by an average of 5 years. Pretty astonishing. So following the Biosafety Committee meeting, the NBC meeting, the Chinese Ministry of Agriculture approved only 2 of the 8 pending products. And so approval of only 2 of these 8 obviously is disappointing, and I'm concerned that China will not honor the spirit of the 100-day plan in approving the remaining 6 products. So I understand the NBC is set to meet again by the end of June, giving us the opportunity to have the other 6 products approved. What is USTR doing to ensure China follows through and approves the remaining 6 products before the conclusion of the 100-day plan?
Well, thank you, Congressman. First of all, I would say that there was some progress made in the 100-day plan, as you suggest, and this is one of the principal areas where there was progress. We are continuing to press China. We expect and will require that they, after they follow their process and very quickly approve all 8 documents, all 8 applications. This is important not just because of those, because it actually delays U.S. farmers from implementing a lot of these high-tech techniques in domestic market as well as internationally. So I can assure you that Secretary Ross is very focused on this, is making it very clear that this has to be done. We've been in contact with the Chinese as recently as the last couple days on this, and my feeling is that before long we're going to have all 8 of them agreed to. That's what we expect. That's what we think was agreed to, and the Secretary, as I say, is who actually had that negotiation at that time, is very focused on it.
Okay, thank you. I know that there's a great opportunity in being good stewards of our natural resources with biotechnology. We've got a great story to tell of how far we've come utilizing biotechnology, and I think it's very promising for the future. I was pleased to see the President's budget did include a renewal of the GSP program, and this is very important. More specifically, the recent GSP reauthorization included language to also consider for duty-free access a variety of travel goods. The previous administration did not provide the consideration for travel goods from all eligible countries as intended by the law, and instead only provided it to the least developed and AGOA nations. I appreciated Ambassador Froman's basically delegating that, or deferring that expansion to the current administration. Could you give us an update on that effort in GSP and travel goods?
Yes, well, I don't necessarily appreciate him deferring it, but no, I say that just in jest. No, we are in the process of looking at it right now. We're very close. The documents are in front of me, and I think you'll see an outcome very soon. And my guess is you won't be disappointed.
Okay. Thank you. Again, thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kind. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being with us here today. Mr. Ambassador, I want to just make a couple of comments before I ask you a question more specifically involving the dairy issue we have with Canada and NAFTA renegotiation. But my first comment is I hope, and this is a good start today, that your approach in dealing with Congress is going to be extremely open, consultative, collaborative. I think it's going to be beneficial that whatever you go out and negotiate, you're going to have to come back here for our approval. And it's better for us to be on the takeoff rather than trying to get us on the landing with these agreements, because we've got to justify and explain this to our bosses back home, too. And Secretary Froman, I think, set a very high standard as far as outreach and time he spent on the Hill, getting feedback from us and us getting feedback from him in the course of the negotiations. That also included language of what was being negotiated. Now, past USTR offices have been loath or reluctant to share language with us. If that occurs in the future, that's going to cause problems. I'm just telling you right now. And with that in mind, I recently just sent you, as well as Secretary Perdue, a letter inviting you to come back with me to my home in Wisconsin to have a good meeting with our agriculture producers. I think you're going to find that getting out of the bubble of Washington can be extremely helpful, just going out into the countryside and listening to people and getting feedback from them. We had a great farm visit with Secretary Froman a couple of years ago where he got a lot of good input from agriculture producers in my large agricultural area. So I hope you seriously consider the invitation and possibly find time to come to me to the Midwest and have that conversation with folks back home. And in regards to NAFTA, I may be in the minority on this side of the dais or even within my own party, but I happen to believe that our withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement will go down as one of the great strategic mistakes that we made in the 21st century, unless you and this administration figures out a way to get us back into the game, into the fastest growing economic market in the globe, the Pacific Rim area. Because right now, a tremendous vacuum has been created. These countries were looking to us for leadership, and they don't have it. We turned our back on them, and that vacuum will be more than willing to be filled by China. And if we have to operate from the outside looking in, trying to compete with China's rules, that will be a race to the bottom. And that will not help us or our people economically in this country. And with TPP in mind, I hope, and we've talked to Secretary Ross about this, that it seems to me just logically a good place to start with NAFTA renegotiation is to look to what Mexico and Canada has already agreed to under TPP, the elevation of standards that were included in the agreement, the reduction of tariff and non-tariff barriers that they had agreed to. And if you have ideas on how to improve upon that, let's go, let's do it. But if I see slippage in those standards from what they had already agreed to under TPP, that's going to be a problem from my perspective too. We can't be going backwards now on something that was already agreed to with Canada and Mexico. And, you know, a lot of people think NAFTA renegotiation, mainly Mexico. We also have problems with Canada. And one is the dairy issue right now with their Class 6 and Class 7 pricing system with ultra-filtered milk, something that wasn't addressed with NAFTA, but which many, if not all of our dairy producers right now feel that they're being treated in an unfair and discriminatory manner. So I'm hoping that you have a plan for moving forward and trying to resolve this so that we level the playing field. And that's a two-way street when it comes to the exchange of products, but especially the issue we're having with Canada right now with dairy. And I'd be interested to hear if you've been thinking about this at all, or if you have some type of plan to move forward on, and hopefully look forward to some additional meetings where we could talk a little bit more in detail about what we feel needs to be done dealing with Canada and in renegotiation.
Great, thank you, Congressman. First of all, I do believe that this is a partnership, and we don't want to bring an agreement back here that doesn't pass. That doesn't make an implementing bill doesn't pass, so that makes no sense. So we want to be involved. I completely agree. Senator Dole used to always say the same thing: if you want me on the plane when it lands, put me on it when it takes off. And I always thought that was good advice. In the second place, I have some background on the Hill, and I understand the importance of Congress. And to be candid, I enjoy working with Congress. So that's number one. Number two, with respect to TPP, the president didn't pull out of the Asia-Pacific area. He pulled out of TPP. He wants to be engaged, and I think we're going to do a better job. It's not going to happen in a week or two, but And there's also questions I always had when I talked to people about, do you think TPP was going to pass anyway? There are questions as to whether or not that was ever, whether that train was ever going to, whether that, I guess with your analogy, whether that plane was ever going to leave the airport. Having said that, the final thing I would say on, because I'm so clock conscious here, is that on the issue of Canadian dairy, yes, we're very much involved in that. We care very much. And you say, do we have a plan? I've got like this thick of options. So it's something we are focused on for a whole variety of reasons.
Great. I'd love to stay in touch with you on that as we move forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kind. Ms. Jenkins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, thank you for being here to talk trade with us this morning. National security should unquestionably be a priority of any government, but I worry that using national security as a basis for trade restrictions in NAFTA or elsewhere could backfire if other countries do the same to us. In particular, food security for many countries is a vital component of national security. Along that vein, here at home, wheat farmers in my eastern Kansas district are just finishing their wheat harvest, and the work continues to roll north and west across the state. Many Kansas farmers will then ultimately look to foreign markets, either in North America or abroad, to sell their products in the coming months. What argument would you make to a country that tries to restrict its imports of U.S. wheat or other products for food security reasons?
Well, in the first place, it's, as I said before, it's a legitimate argument should you use national security in the case of steel. I believe it's a legitimate argument. I, however, think that it's a legitimate use of the statute if the president decides to go in that direction. Steel, aluminum, these are national security issues, in my opinion. Now, there's always the argument, are you worried about somebody else using it? Yes, I'm worried about somebody else using it, but they have to have a legitimate reason also. They can't just willy-nilly use it, or we would challenge them. And my guess is that any country that thought they had a legitimate reason to use national security would, in fact, use it, whether we use it or not. I mean, that's my own personal belief. I don't see how someone could preclude Kansas wheat based on a national security of food, a food need basis. That doesn't strike me as a legitimate argument. If it certainly happened, we would have to decide what makes sense in our judgment. And I can assure you that the president will look at this very, very hard, and the reaction will be the same as we're going to have with respect to any time we take an action on trade at all. There's always the possibility of somebody retaliating against us. It even happens when you do something in anti-dumping or countervailing duty or all the normal things. There's always a possibility of retaliation, and the question you have is, what are you going to do in response? And that's something that we're thinking about. But if we get unfair retaliation against us, I would affect the president to act very strongly. I would expect him to take the position that we won't tolerate that.
Okay, great, thanks. About 50% of all U.S. grown wheat is exported, making trade incredibly important to a wheat state like Kansas. Mexico, for example, is the largest export market for U.S. wheat, last year made possible by the benefits of NAFTA. In fact, according to the National Association of Wheat Growers and the U.S. Wheat Associates, Mexico imported 3.1 million metric tons of wheat in the 2016-2017 marketing year. In the views of many of my constituents, NAFTA has been overwhelmingly successful. I do agree, however, there's room for updating in this agreement, which is more than 20 years old, to include strong and enforceable SPS rules based on sound science, like those that were negotiated under the TPP. Kansas farmers and ranchers are also looking beyond NAFTA to future trade deals for additional markets. What are your views on how NAFTA renegotiation can serve as a blueprint for securing those future trade deals, which would mean the inclusion of strong SPS provisions that will help the Kansas producers gain new market access? Well,
SPS is something that needs updating, and it's an important objective. Generally, there are advantages in putting in model agreements and negotiation between Mexico, the United States, and Canada because we have a long history. We don't have a lot of the some of the outlier economic activity that you might have if you were negotiating with somebody else. For example, we don't have massive state-owned enterprises in either place. So I think that NAFTA is, as you suggest, it's a great opportunity to put in place between the three countries very high-level provisions with respect to a variety of things. SPS is one of them, but there are also others. People have suggested currency. It was a kind of a classic example of what you're talking about, where there really aren't currency problems between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. But that makes it a good opportunity for everyone to sit down and say, okay, let's put together a model agreement here that ought to apply to everyone. So I look upon NAFTA as a real opportunity to create a model. And I believe that with respect to some of these things, the Canadians and the Mexicans look upon it the same way. And then take those provisions with the additional legitimacy of being in the NAFTA and be able to use those in future negotiations.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We look forward to working with you. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thanks, Ms. Jenkins. Mr. Pascrell, you're recognized.
Morning, Mr. Chairman.
Morning.
Mr. Ambassador, congratulations on your confirmation. Good luck. You're going to need it. We've heard a lot of talk about what should be changed. I have to say that in various meetings with the U.S. Trade Representative and Department of Commerce, White House officials, I and many of my colleagues find ourselves confused by the inconsistency from this administration when it comes to trade. We need some very basic questions answered. So I'm going to get into the questions, but I want to associate myself with the words of Mr. Buchanan concerning the difference between the bilateral agreements and regional agreements. I think he's on target. I think it'd be foolish simply to deal in those bilateral agreements. This is a different world, and we need to understand that. And I'd like to associate myself also with Mr. Larson's comments on the relationship between our trade agreements and stagnant wages in the United States and the ability to create new jobs. There's a lot of data coming out on this. Trade affects things in our own country, and we need to take a look at the labor market to understand it fully. Now, the President called NAFTA a disaster, and all I'm hearing so far is tweaking the edges. If it's a disaster, then I'm looking at least 22 speeches that he made during the campaign, where he riled up people about the trade agreements. Now, I voted against many of those trade agreements, so one would think we're on the same side. We are not. We are not. And the administration's notice to Congress of an intent to renegotiate NAFTA, your office failed to provide us with specific negotiating objectives or detailed descriptions of what you would like to see changed. Many American manufacturing companies have moved to Mexico, for instance, because of the much lower labor costs across the border. Mexican manufacturing workers make only 20 cents on the dollar that we do, and they have yet to comply with minimum internationally recognized labor standards. So today, when Mr. Levin asked about implementing reforms prior to renegotiation, you would not commit to demanding labor improvements in Mexico. And you did the same thing yesterday when you were questioned by the good senator from Ohio. Now, I'm disappointed you did not respond. So how will you ensure how will you ensure that Mexico enforces labor provisions in a new NAFTA, now that we're going to abandon this disaster, if they have failed to meet basic internationally recognized labor standards? Before you answer that question, I want to remind you, I did submit to you the principles of trade which we are having as our standards. I want to know what your standards are. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
We expect to negotiate an agreement that has enforceable labor standards, and we expect them to be consistent with the agreement that the committee had with the Bush administration on May 10th, 2007. We expect them to be enforceable, and I look forward to working with the members of the committee to make sure that happens. In spite of the disagreements that you articulated, I think that with respect to labor standards, my guess is we're not that far apart.
All time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Pascrell.
Mr. Chairman, I will submit the other questions to the ambassador with your approval.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll now move to 2-to-1 questioning to balance out the rest of the hearing. Mr. Paulson, you're recognized.
Mr. Ambassador, the movement of data around the world is essential for businesses of all types here in the 21st century, from automobiles to airplanes to agriculture and different apps. Access to data around the globe is paramount importance for businesses of all sizes in order to compete in a global economy. So data flows today have they've grown by 45 times since 2005, and they're expected to grow by another 9 times by 2020. However, as you know, currently there are no enforceable trade rules specifically protecting data flows, which leaves American companies vulnerable to digital manipulation by foreign governments. And such efforts include data localization, forced technology, or source code transfers, and other pernicious efforts that undermine competition from U.S. companies. And both you and Secretary Ross have voiced public support for enforceable digital trade rules in your confirmation hearings, as well as more recently. So does the administration view inclusion of digital trade rules as a top priority for NAFTA modernization and other future trade agreements?
Absolutely.
That's good to hear. And Ambassador, you've also mentioned that you have notified Congress of the intent to initiate negotiations with Mexico and Canada regarding NAFTA. Given that NAFTA modernization will set that precedent also for future negotiations with other countries and other agreements, it's a tremendous opportunity to help break down barriers to digital trade and allow U.S. companies to compete in North America. Can you share with us or the committee any information about Mexico and Canada's views on digital trade heading into those negotiations?
I have not had discussions with Mexico or Canada with respect to this issue. We expect to have a digital chapter, as you suggest. We expect it to be a very high-level agreement. I will have discussions with them, but I have to be careful because we're not allowed to begin negotiations until we go through the TPA process, which we take as a very important commitment. Having said that, I guess I would be very surprised if both of them didn't agree fundamentally that we need this. Neither one of them are in the group of countries that are, as you suggest, trying to create new industries by using tactics like forced transfer of technology, like data localization rules. So I'm optimistic that we'll be able to put together a good chapter, but I certainly take it from our point of view that it would be very difficult to pass a NAFTA implementing bill that doesn't have a very high standard digital chapter.
Good. That's good to hear. Let me just shift gears real quick. You know, the United States and then my home state of Minnesota is a leader in medical device innovation and growing exports in that area that create a lot of really good jobs here at home and then help improve healthcare outcomes around the world. And other countries now are increasingly taking very extreme and misguided measures to control healthcare costs. As an example, in India, we're seeing severe price controls that disproportionately affect American medical device manufacturers, putting them at a competitive disadvantage. India has also rejected requests by U.S. medical device manufacturers to withdraw affected products from the market and then has announced its intention to impose price controls on additional categories of medical devices. And then another example would be in Italy, where only U.S. publicly traded companies are required to account for expected revenue losses related to a yet-to-be-implemented and highly controversial payback law that would require companies to pay back to the government any medical device spending in excess of an arbitrary predetermined level of spending. And these are policies that hurt American companies and deters these companies from introducing new innovative technologies in these markets, which ultimately means patients are going to have less access to these products. So can you just share a little bit, how will the administration work with India or other foreign governments to ensure that our companies are not being driven out of the market by arbitrary price caps or spending measures that make it impossible for innovative companies to compete?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I have met with a group of medical device executives, and I've heard the horror stories, and that really is what it is. This is an issue that we are raising with India, and we're going to use the Prime Minister's visit as a launching pad to make sure that this gets proper attention. So everything you say we completely agree with. All we can do at this point is raise with them, show the unfairness of them, and this, to me, fits into the category also of things that if you have a big trade surplus with the United States, you should not be doing things like this to the United States. They should be trying to encourage. Trying to encourage imports from the U.S. And their problem is even bigger because this is another example. The medical device area is another example where China is now going to move in. Has it on their Made in China 2025 list of industries that they want to become world-class in. So this is an industry that I think we really do have to focus on, and we met with them and we expect to put together an action plan.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Paulson. Mr. Martin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here today. I've got a couple of questions and issues I want to bring to you about the negotiations of NAFTA and how they may affect my district in Texas. My district is the DFW Airport. DFW Airport is the center of my congressional district. The airport has an astonishing value that it adds to our economy of $37 billion a year. The Metroplex area that encompasses my congressional district is generating nearly $500 billion in the GDP, and the DFW Airport is the driving force behind much of that growth. Most people in Texas say that the airport really is the economic generator for the whole state. Just recently, the mayors of Fort Worth and Dallas and a delegation traveled to Toronto, and their main concern was that both parties, both those in Toronto and Dallas-Fort Worth, are uneasy about the upcoming negotiations, and they want to make sure that these relationships that they've developed over the past few decades are going to last. So I'd like to know what steps the administration is taking to make sure that the areas of the country that experienced economic growth as a benefit of NAFTA won't be harmed or see a downtick in the results of the modernization.
Thank you, Congressman. First of all, we are very much aware of how important that airport is to the state of Texas, and we're also aware, as the Chairman points out, that Texas is the #1 exporting state in the country at this point, as I understand it. So our objective is to have more trade, not less trade, and our objective is to, first of all, do no harm. We expect that as a result of this, the U.S. will have more sales, and we hope that there's more trade. But clearly, with respect to the provisions that where NAFTA has been successful, we want to secure that going forward.
Thank you. Lastly, I'd like to bring up a letter that was sent to you by our two senators on June the 8th. And basically, the letter states that NAFTA has played a key role in all North American energy markets, such as oil and natural gas, and that the NAFTA agreement allows the United States to maximize the benefit of being the world's largest energy producers. As the administration moves forward, I'd like to echo the sentiments of this letter and ask for your opinion on the free flow of energy products, including electricity, oil, and natural gas across the U.S. and Mexico and Canadian borders.
Yes, I agree with you. We think that Senator Cornyn was, of course, on the Finance Committee where I testified yesterday, and you're right. This did come up. We support the free flow of energy across the borders. We think it's one of the advantages we have as a North American market.
And you don't think that any of the NAFTA negotiations that we contemplate will have any effect on that free flow?
I'm not privy, obviously, to what the other people want to do.
Right.
We think it's been a success. We hope it fits in the category of do no harm, and we hope that everyone agrees with that, although there are complications in this area, as you know.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Marchant. Following the practice of the Gibbons rule, Ms. Sewell, you're recognized. Yes, ma'am. Oh, Ms. Delbeni, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being here with us today. First, we talked a little bit about digital trade, and digital trade is critically important. We have 3 million Americans who are employed in the internet sector, and it's helped the United States achieve a trade surplus, a $159 billion trade surplus. So this is a very, very important issue. In order to build on this, and I know you mentioned that digital trade would be a priority in any NAFTA renegotiation, how will you ensure that digital trade is prioritized within your office with appropriate levels of the agency?
Well, first of all, as I went through my confirmation process and in meeting with members of the Ways and Means Committee, digital trade after agriculture probably is the #1 thing that's raised. And it is self-evident that it's very, very important to the U.S. economy, and it's an area where we have a real competitive advantage. So it is important. We have at USTR a position that was created just last year. It has not been filled yet, but for a intellectual property innovation ambassador who is a negotiator who's responsible for that area. We're in the process right now of filling that spot, and that'll be someone who will, along with a few other things, focus very much on exactly this area. So we do understand how important it is, and we think it's an important way to get our trade deficit down, which is a primary objective of the
Thank you.
president.
I urge you to fill that position quickly. That's an important area.
Are you available between now and then? You're probably.
I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about cloud computing and some of the issues we're seeing with China. Various Chinese regulations are making it difficult or even impossible for U.S. technology companies to operate in China, possibly in violation of WTO commitments. Specifically, I'm concerned with China's proposed draft regulations that, when combined with existing Chinese law, would require U.S. cloud providers to transfer valuable intellectual property and effectively hand over control of their businesses to Chinese companies in order to operate. Global cloud services totaled more than $100 billion in 2016, has a very strong presence in my district and in my state. So it's very critical that the U.S.-China Comprehensive Economic Dialogue's 100-day work plan includes a commitment by China to resolve this problem. And so I wanted to hear from you. Are you aware of this issue, and can you talk about any progress that the administration is making towards addressing this issue?
Well, yes, Congresswoman, I am aware of the issue. It's an extremely important issue, and to me, when I read about it, it's another example of a country being a mercantilist and basically having an industrial policy. They see an industry or a sector that has value, that's high technology, that has a huge growth potential, that affects not just its own sector, but every sector, right? Because it's this linkage that's so important, and then they try to get themselves in the position where they take over first within their own country and then way beyond that. So it's exactly the same pattern that we see everywhere. They limit, you have to have a partner before you can go in. Anyone who hasn't followed this issue, it's worth looking at as it's a prototype of exactly how they've gotten to where they are in a whole bunch of industries for non-economic reasons. None of this has anything to do with the economy. So it's an extremely important issue. It's something that I'm focused on, that the Secretary of Commerce is focused on, and others in the administration are focused on. And we are raising our complaints with the Chinese, and we're looking at all of our options. So we're aware of the issue. We realize how important it is, and we are engaged on it.
Thank you. You know, China, the fact that China has these regulations is particularly really offensive, given the fact that Chinese cloud computing companies don't face these types of restrictions when they operate in the U.S. So.
I mean, this is an extremely important point. There's no reciprocity at all, and it's something that if we can take care of it through current law, we should do, and if we can't, the Congress should look at it. In my judgment, as a policy.
One quick point, which will be for the record because we don't have time. I want to make sure you're aware of some of the concerns and questions we've heard about the covered agreement with respect to the EU, and so I'll submit a question for the record on there, and I'd appreciate your feedback on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Del Bene. Mr. Renacci, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome you, Ambassador, as from one Buckeye to another. My district, Mr. Ambassador, starts in Northeast Ohio, so it's in Northeast Ohio. It starts in Cuyahoga County and then rolls all the way down into Wayne County. Because of that, Wayne County actually is one of the largest dairy-producing districts in the state. Ohio dairy sector relies significantly on exports. I'm particularly interested in the potential to make good use of our engagement with Canada. To tackle both excessive tariffs our industry still faces there, and just as importantly, the non-tariff policies Canada has been using to distort trade. Canada's new Class 6 and 7 pricing tools seem designed to let Canada have its cake and eat it too at our expense. The programs are a concern not only to companies exporting to Canada, but also those exporting protein products around the world, since the Canadian programs are designed to undercut ourselves on both fronts. How do we tackle both the problems facing us now with Canada on dairy and find a way forward to establish more open and dependable trading conditions with them on dairy?
Well, first of all, if you had said Ashtabula County, I would have paid more attention. But seriously, we are very much aware of this issue. I've talked to the Minister Freeland in Canada about it, and as you say, the way to think about it is exactly the way you put it. This is not just about exports from the United States to Canada. This is about the exports from the United States to everywhere, because they have created such really as a byproduct, such a volume of dried skim milk that they can knock us out of markets everywhere. So it's way beyond just a problem with Canada. It's something that we are engaged on, and that we've heard from not only members from Ohio, but obviously members from Wisconsin and from all over the place. And it is something that we want to deal with in the context of NAFTA. And I have our agriculture people at USTR are engaged on it. They have a variety of options that we're looking at right now.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, I'm an avid motorcycle rider. I understand, I learned this past week that Vice President Pence is also an avid motorcycle rider. But on the EU-US beef hormone trade dispute issue, motorcycles are on the approved list for 100% import tariff, specifically 51cc to 500cc. If this import tariff goes into effect, it would do economic harm to motorcycle dealerships and facilities in the state of Ohio and seriously impact domestic consumers. My question to you is, a number of us here in the Congress have expressed our concern over the import tariff proposal on motorcycles and how harmful it would be on our constituents, as the USTR has done in the past. Would you withdraw motorcycles from the approved import tariff list in the EU-US beef hormone trade dispute?
Well, My hope is that we're going to negotiate our way out of this, and that is our objective. Our objective. I realize there are a variety of products that are on the potential list, and nothing's been happening to anybody at this point. I know that the motorcycle industry and motorcycle riders have been very activated on this. I'm sympathetic to their position, but right now we're just hoping to negotiate it out. I'm not taking anything off of the list at this point. I think that would be counterproductive to the negotiation.
All right. I would hope we take a good look at this. And again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to participate in this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Meehan. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, for being here today. You're one of the themes. Many of the themes get repetitive by the time you get down to this point of the aisle, but I want to attach myself to the comments that have been made by a couple of my colleagues with regard to the importance of the free flow of data and the effort that we are putting in with the recognition that what you do here with NAFTA may also may have some influence with regard to bilateral agreements that you intend to reach with other countries. As we are looking at Europe and other places, the questions of privacy demands and others in the European sector create a genuine concern for the free flow of data. So you did say that you were looking towards putting the highest level people in your organization as focused on those questions. May I inquire the position that you are looking for with the IP ambassador? Is that something that requires Senate approval, or is that within your own bailiwick?
It requires a Senate approval.
So this is part of a problem. I hope my colleagues on the other side who are concerned about this issue would be weighing in with their colleagues in the Senate to assure that we would have this kind of support for that very, very important position. But I thank you for your emphasis on that and hope that in lieu of that appointment, you will still look to assure that there are senior level people working on those negotiations. Another issue which I know you are well aware of but continues to have great significance has been the patent protection for innovation that takes place in the United States in the biopharma and area. There are questions about data protection for biologic drugs and other kinds of. This has certainly been a part of TPP negotiations in the past, and we were not really resolved in a way that was as clear in TPP negotiations, with the 5+3 being about the best, notwithstanding many representations by the trade rep that they were looking for the 12 years of patent protection that are enjoyed here in the United States. Currently, as best as I can understand, Canada does not recognize 12 years of protections for the biologics, and Mexico is ambiguous at this point in time. Is it your intention to try to work in that space to maximize the protections for biologics?
Yes, absolutely.
We would be grateful for your continuing commitment to that. And can you address for me as well what you might be able to do with regard to mechanisms for patent disputes where they may arise in the context of that space?
Well, I mean, this is another area where we want to have discussions, and where NAFTA will, the whole protection of intellectual property will be a major issue in this negotiation, not just in the biologic area, but in the dispute area. There have been, for those members who aren't aware, there have been a number of cases in Canada where we think unfairly people have lost their patent protection, and this is something that we're going to focus on. We understand the issue. We think it's a significant issue, and it's a surprise to a lot of members who don't focus on it like you do that this is something that would go on in Canada.
Well, I thank you. I thank you for your attention to those important issues, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Meehan. Dr. Davis, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Ambassador. I live in Chicago, Illinois, and my hometown has the largest concentration of companies that process sugar-contained products made in our country. They're currently, though, paying 75% more for sugar than their competitors who can buy on the world market. In the TPP partnership agreement negotiations, a consensus was reached without significant dissent in the U.S. to increase the sugar export quotas for Australia and Canada. What my constituents would like to know is, are these legacy negotiations regarding additional access for the U.S. sugar market going to be on the table during the renegotiation of NAFTA with Canada and Mexico?
Well, we have, with respect to Mexico, we have an agreement that was entered into, a suspension agreement that was entered into, and it seems unlikely that that's going to change in the context of NAFTA. It's certainly, with respect to Mexico and Canada, it's something that if members care about, we will be informed by what the members' views are on it, and we will certainly take note of the fact that you're concerned about it. But we do have the biggest sugar issue we have right now is Mexico, and our sense is in the context of that litigation of the Title VII litigation that we have a suspension agreement, which I think will probably end up resolving that issue through the negotiation.
I serve as co-chair of something called the Sugar Caucus. And of course, Chicago used to be known as the candy capital of America. Our members are expressing serious concern about the continuing domestic rise in sugar price, which has actually caused already a number of our companies and corporations and entities to move or relocate out of the country or to look elsewhere to purchase their sugar because they use huge amounts of it. Some of the candy and other things that are made, mostly sugar. Could you share with us the administration's concerns relative to this continuing rise in domestic sugar prices for these businesses?
Well, Congressman, I don't have any views on that issue. It's more of an agriculture issue from my point of view. I'm concerned about the trade aspects of it, and will certainly want to engage with the committee on that. But the domestic price of sugar is out of my purview. I'm not unsympathetic to the points you make, but I have this whole world of things that are probably impossible to do, and if I add domestic agriculture prices to it, then I'll go from small chance to zero chance. So I think I have to sort of stay in the realm of trade.
We would urge you to add this trade issue anytime we continue to lose jobs that we can't replace. That becomes, for me, a trade issue as well as an agriculture issue. And so we would just urge you to take a real serious look at this issue and this problem. I thank you so much for being here, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Ms. Noem, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, for being with us today. I know you're busy working on NAFTA renegotiations and modernization and new trade opportunities for us in this country. But I also want to thank you for your work with Secretary Ross and the Commerce Department on allowing U.S. beef back into China. That's huge for my state of South Dakota and our cattle producers, and access to the $2.5 billion market is welcome news for all of us. What concerns me about the deal is that our beef is going to have a tough time getting back up to that 70% import market share that American beef producers enjoyed previously. Australia, one of our top competitors in the region, has negotiated a free trade agreement with China to completely reduce tariffs on their beef by 2024. So as we work to modernize NAFTA, other countries are working on free trade agreements, and we're losing market share in foreign economies. So what's your plan to ensure that American agriculture exports are going to be on a level playing field in foreign markets, so we won't continue to see our market share reduction in other countries, and also getting there quickly before those other countries are able to snatch up that market share before we get other agreements completed?
Well, first of all, we're very pleased with what was accomplished with respect to beef in the China 100-day plan. And we think there are lots of other restrictions that we can eliminate with respect to all agricultural products in China. Many times the U.S. has the best and the cheapest product, and there's some reason, there's some impediment to the importation, and that was a classic example in the beef case, and in many cases it's also poultry. There are a whole variety of these kinds of issues. So the first thing we have to do is remove impediments to trade, to U.S. trade. U.S. agriculture, as you know far better than I do, is the best. It's the most competitive, and it's the cheapest. And if we have a level playing field, we'll do fine. I think it is extremely unlikely that we're going to end up with a free trade negotiation with China for a whole variety of reasons that I'd be, happy to sit down and talk about. But we do have a lot of leverage with China in terms of them removing impediments and granting access to U.S. agricultural products, U.S. beef particularly. I mean, the reality is that they have a $350 billion surplus with us. You get a certain amount of leverage with that if you're willing to use it. And it fits into the category of the people who can't have that kind of in the history of the world, there's never been anything that was so imbalanced as that, and that gives us a certain amount of leverage. So continuing to push on those issues is important. In addition, there's a lot of talk about other FTAs, bilateral FTAs. Mm-hmm. One of the ones that the beef producers always talk about, of course, is Japan. Mm-hmm. So we have discussions with the Japanese. We're not necessarily at this point moving in the direction of an FTA because they're probably not ready to talk, and neither are we. But we have a structure that's under the vice president where we're engaging in an economic dialogue. We're talking about a variety of issues, these kinds of issues. And it's the kind of thing that at some point may lead to an FTA, which I know is very important to agriculture. The final thing that I would say on this issue is Japan has had a $60 or $70 billion trade surplus with the United States since I was at USTR 30 years ago. And I've taken the position that on these kinds of areas, at least on a temporary basis, the Japanese ought to be making unilateral concessions. The reality is that it's in their interest. It's not like you're pushing out Japanese production in that case. You'd be pushing out another competitor's production. So I think that's something that we ought to look at. They ought to be letting our beef in at least on a temporary basis, just as an effort to get their trade deficit down and to show good faith in moving forward and developing a closer relationship.
I think any reassurance you can continuously give that we're not just focused on a seamless negotiation of NAFTA, that we're continuing to focus on China, we're continuing to focus on Japan, that there's many of these. I know that our number one industry in South Dakota is agriculture. I'm a lifelong farmer and rancher and was a cattle producer for decades. So I know that market share is incredibly important, and they see other countries being aggressive and like reassurances that we're not unilaterally focused on renegotiating NAFTA, that we are continuing to push those other areas. And so I appreciate your work on all of that. And also, I'll mention, I know I'm out of time, but geographical indicators in the European Union as well is an issue. I'll talk with you later, but thank you for your time. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Snow. Mr. Holding, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, first I'd like to thank you and your very able staff for the assistance you have provided and continue to provide to our sweet potato farmers as they face an issue in the EU, a pending issue that could greatly harm their ability to export. And North Carolina makes great sweet potatoes, and we wouldn't want to deprive the world of their great taste and benefits. Touching on some other issues, as you can imagine, and I know that you know, a lot of members of Congress are looking forward to a bilateral agreement with the United Kingdom. I watched the press reports from the meeting that Secretary Ross had with Secretary Liam Fox earlier this week, and out of that meeting, they announced that as early as July that they would begin a preliminary scoping for a U.S.-UK trade agreement. So I'd ask you to explain what preliminary scoping means. What does the working group consist of? Do you have the lead in this? Is Commerce taking the lead in this? And then additionally, regarding TPA, will TPA procedures be followed in this preliminary scoping, including a consultation with Congress during the scoping process?
Well, thank you, Congressman. Yes, as you say, Secretary of State Fox was in town last week. We met with him also. USTR negotiates agreements like this, so while Secretary Ross will be very much involved, USTR will be the hub of this negotiation. The first thing we have to remember is that the UK really can't do anything for a while. They have another several months, probably until the early part, I guess maybe the middle of 2019, before they can actually get out of the EU, and then they would be eligible. There are a variety of things you can do that aren't really a trade negotiation that we can both agree on, things like licensing and this kinds of thing, and I think there's an effort to try to talk about that and do that in the meantime, to discuss the issues. As we get closer to the time that they can actually act, then we would start going through the process that you allude to. But I think at the right time, the UK would like to have an agreement with the United States, and I believe that the United States wants to have an agreement there also. So it's an important activity. It's something that has its own time frame because of their situation, so which is kind of controlling in this case. But we've begun talks about matters of mutual interest, and they're for us a natural partner.
Well, I agree with you, and as you engage in your preliminary scoping, members of Congress who are engaged on this are engaging with our counterparts in the Parliament to talk about what the agreement would entail and get an idea of where potential sticking points might be. We'll always have adverse interests in some regard. Staying on the topic of the UK, I'd urge you, as you look towards 232 investigations, that you recognize the very unique relationship, special relationship with the United Kingdom, particularly in the regard of national security between our two countries, and take that into account and perhaps consider exempting countries like the United Kingdom. Perhaps there is no other country like the United Kingdom regarding our special relationship and national security when you decide what actions you're going to take vis-a-vis 232. Lastly, ISDS has been touched on numerous times today. ISDS and the carve-out of tobacco from ISDS and the TPP was an absolute fatal flaw. And I would encourage you, as you look at trade agreements and look at ISDS and whether it's appropriate in various trade agreements, that you commit to not carving out any sector of our economy from ISDS. As you and I have talked about before, you always have to be mindful of getting to 218 on a trade agreement. And any carve-out of tobacco from ISDS, or really any other privilege and benefit of a trade agreement, would be fairly fatal to arrive into 218. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holding. Mr. Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Lighthizer, for being here. The folks in Southeast and South Central Missouri definitely agree with President Trump and yourself that we believe our trade deals need to put American workers and American farmers and ranchers American families first. I think that's extremely important. In the last 2 decades since NAFTA was signed, a lot has changed in our economy. When you talk with the folks that I represent, they associate NAFTA with job losses. They know someone who's lost factory jobs making shoes or bicycles and even clothing in southeast Missouri. It's incredibly important that NAFTA be updated and modernized, and we need to do it in such a way that puts American workers, businesses, farmers, and consumers first. While the full promise of American manufacturing was not realized under NAFTA, American agriculture saw significant gains in the market access, and this must be preserved. The district I represent is the most diversified agriculture district outside of California. Every August, I do a 2-week farm tour visiting all 30 counties, promoting the diversity and all the different aspects of our district. And in Missouri, we are the 4th largest rice-producing state in the country. And all of that rice is produced in just the 5 counties in the Boot Hill of Missouri, which is my entire congressional district. NAFTA is responsible for making Mexico and Canada the largest market for Missouri rice, with 87% of our exports going to those 2 countries. Mr. Lighthizer, Missouri farmers want to maintain the market access that they currently have in agriculture trade with Mexico and Canada. Any disruption of trade with Mexico and Canada is a concern of our farmers and our ranchers. What will your approach be in the renegotiations to be sure that no new barriers to U.S. agriculture trade are established under NAFTA?
Well, we certainly intend in this negotiation to do no harm to the agriculture sector. Our objective is to modernize, to put in place the things that have to be put in place to correct such things as rules of origin and the like that have become outdated and have led really to a very large trade deficit. We clearly will not be part of a negotiation where there are new barriers to agriculture that come up, for sure.
I appreciate that statement. The task that you have at hand is not an easy one, but I stand with you and the White House and this committee to make sure that we get the best agreement and the best deal for the American citizens. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Black, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, welcome, Ambassador. We're delighted to have you here today and look forward to working with you in the future. I want to talk about one of the issues that is affecting some of the good people and also companies back in my state, and that is the lack of fairness in selling across the Mexican and the Canada borders, where there's a very low dollar value in shipments, the de minimis shipment threshold. Basically, it was set aside as a low dollar shipments for faster and easier processing in and out of countries, but this has, at this point in time, since it's been years since that agreement was made, we really are in a situation where there's an unfairness. For instance, in the U.S., the de minimis shipment level is $800. But when you look at Mexico, it's less than $50. And when you look at Canada, it's $15. And so there's a real unequal treatment and actually a real cost to some of those folks that are doing business, such as FedEx. And FedEx has thousands of workers and employees in my home state of Tennessee that potentially are affected by this, as well as individuals. And so I'd like to know from you if that is something that you're looking at and that you think that we can find some resolution and some equality for our both individuals and also companies in this area.
Yes, thank you, Congressman. First of all, yes, it's something that we're looking at that we take very seriously. It's one of those issues where you think you know something about trade, and then you look at this issue and you think, how's that even possible that this could be happening? And it's a real burden to everybody who ships back and forth, probably more in Canada, but even as you say, quite a bit going back to Mexico. So It's a very large problem. It's the kind of thing that fits into the category of reciprocity, where you say to yourself, how is it possible that we could be so much, it could be so much easier to ship it here than it is to ship to those two countries. So we're going to look at it, and I hope there's a resolution that's satisfactory to your constituents. It's clearly a priority. It seems like the kind of thing that would be easy enough to fix. It can't be in anyone's interest, just from a management point of view, to have these tiny little thresholds. It has to be a burden on them, I would think, and I hope it's not done intentionally. I hope it's just a question of something that's just built up over time. But it's something we're going to look at and we're going to focus on.
Well, I appreciate that, because my understanding is these thresholds were set many, many years ago when things were different as far as the way in which shipment was done, the cost of products, and so on. And so this seems to be something that has been around for a while and needs to be revisited, and the sooner the better for both individuals and for companies on the cost that's borne by this inequity. The second one that I want to talk to you is one that has come to my attention just most recently, and it is the issue of the U.S.-EU covered agreement on insurance. And it actually came to my attention by a couple of different sources. One was the Tennessee Farm Bureau in my state, which is a very large industry and does a lot of business around the country, around the world as well. And then I also heard from the Tennessee Insurance Commission and our own Commissioner, Julie McPeak, who is the Commissioner of Insurance in Tennessee, was here a couple of weeks ago testifying before the Senate. And so this agreement that was put into place, and I understand it was pretty much rushed through by the previous administration in their closing days to change the way that insurance products are treated across borders, has not seemed to be in the best interest to those here in the United States. And probably the biggest part of this is there's just not clarity. And there are a lot of questions there about what do these agreements mean. And so I wanted to know if that is something that you're aware of and that you're looking at getting some clarity for the insurance, for those who do insurance.
Yes, thank you, Congress. So I am very much aware of the issue. It's something that the Secretary of Treasury and I have to come to grips with here in the not too distant future, and in fact have meetings scheduled, very soon for he and I to sit down and discuss this issue. So it's a good time to have your view on it.
Well, I appreciate that. I think since the President is really very adamant about America first, that we need to make sure that we're not in some way putting our companies and our folks here in the United States behind other countries with a lack of clarity, and making sure that there is an equality in treatment there as well. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Rice, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador Lighthizer, for being here and your patience in waiting for 2.5 hours to allow me to ask you a few questions. I think that I'm very much aligned with the administration. Mr. Trump says, make America great again. I say, make America competitive again. And two of the things that give me the most hope, most optimism about this administration are your appointment and the appointment of Mr. Ross. So I'm really excited about fair and free trade. I appreciate your focus on the steel industry. I have already had one steel mill in Georgetown, South Carolina close during my 4 years here. During my 4 years here, I've had a constant stream of apparently legitimate complaints about abusive trade practices, particularly from China. So I've got Nucor Steel in my district, got a company called Met Glass in Conway, who've lost employees because of these unfair trade practices, and I very much appreciate your focus on that. But I want to talk about something more fundamental, and that is what Mr. Nunes broached earlier, that being the fact that 140 other countries, including every one of our significant trading partners, have adopted border adjustment taxes generally through the value-added tax system. And I know this hearing is about trade, but we've heard how so many factors enter into fair trade earlier today, whether it be employment practices, environmental practices, taxes, and others. So what I'm particularly curious about is in negotiating these trade agreements, how can you ensure that we achieve fair trade, trade where American companies and American workers can compete on a level playing field? How can you ensure that when other countries are applying border adjustment taxes on our products when they hit their shores and we're not doing the same thing to them? How can you, when you renegotiate NAFTA, account for the fact that Mexico has a 16% border adjustment through a VAT, and we don't have the same offsetting tax, and therefore American workers and American companies are at a huge disadvantage?
Well, thank you, Congressman. First of all, I have spent a lot of time thinking about this issue, and I think that disequilibrium between direct and indirect taxes is a serious problem. Now, there are a lot of different ways to deal with it, and so I'm not in a position where I want to say what's the best way. And in addition, I'm not paid to worry about taxes. I'm pretty worried about other things.
I agree and understand that you're not paid to worry about taxes, and this is a trade hearing, but don't taxes have a very direct impact on
Absolutely.
trade?
They have taxes have a direct effect on competitiveness. And competitiveness is what trade is all about at its core. Trade is about competitiveness. So taxes are a huge issue. In terms of direct or indirect taxes, I think there is a real problem, but when I do my negotiations, I take those systems the way they are, and people make their own judgments for their own societal reasons as to whether or not they want to have value-added taxes or income taxes or how they want to structure all that. But I'm not blind to the fact that it does make a difference in the real world. The most important thing, I think, is to get taxes down and to do all the other things that we need to do to become competitive. And in the area of taxes, there are a lot of different options. And as I noted, there has been a tendency on behalf of most countries, really, or at least many countries, would probably be more accurate, to move from income taxes to an indirect taxes.
And there has been that tendency, and would you speculate that that tendency was due in some part to the fact that it makes them more competitive with respect to manufacturing and importing and exporting?
Well, my guess is that they do it for a variety of reasons. And probably that's one. In respect to some issues, and this is something that's always been of concern to Republicans with respect to a value-added tax, I think to some extent people go to it because they think it's easier to raise taxes. And that there are a lot of people, conservative Republicans, who have the view that one of the principal reasons, that's an overstatement, but one reason that Europe has gone the way they've gone is because it's been too easy to raise taxes. So these are not totally, I mean, there's a lot of things to sort of think about in this discussion.
This issue on competitiveness of American products, it doesn't just apply to manufacturing, it applies to agriculture as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely correct.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Mr. Walorski, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, it's good to see you. Thanks for hanging in with us. And I just wanted to thank you. I'm from the state of Indiana. I want to thank you for indulging me when you first came in today and talking and chatting about this Section 232 that we've talked a little bit about. But I am more than concerned about the impact on aluminum and the aluminum industry as it pertains to my district in northern Indiana and my state. I would just ask that, you know, to consider the anxiety from my constituents about the prospect of tariffs and quotas on inputs that they depend on to make RVs, trailers, and all sorts of other products. I've already been contacted by some of these manufacturers, and they're already being impacted by price differences, and they're very, very uncertain as to what's going to happen, as am I. And I appreciate your willingness to look into it. But could you convey to the President, to Secretary Ross, my request that they conduct these investigations and decisions that they're making thoughtfully, thoroughly, transparently to determine what the impact of action might be for American companies and to avoid any type of quick action that would hurt these companies? Could you just convey that information?
Yes, I will. I would be happy to do that.
And then I just want to associate my remarks with previous remarks of Representative Paulson about this issue in India And our issue is the same type of thing, and it goes along with the medical device industry. And what we're seeing already, and again, in Indiana, we are full of medical device manufacturers. So they're worried about the sudden and drastic nature of cuts, what it means to the products already being sold there and products they may want to sell in India for the future. Myself and Mr. Kind, previously who spoke, sent a letter with 16 of our colleagues to the Indian ambassador voicing our strong concerns, and I'm happy to provide that letter to you. My question for you is, what else can we do on Capitol Hill to help you with these issues with the medical devices? We're looking specifically at stents and some of the prohibitions and just some of the things you referred to earlier. But is there anything else we can do to help you besides sending letters to their ambassador?
Well, first of all, the issue is a very serious one. Secondly, I have met with the manufacturers, and they're in a position where they literally are forced to sell something they don't want to sell way below the price of manufacturing it. I mean, it's like you can't even understand it. I think it's something that we are taking seriously, we're focusing on, and just the more pressure Congress can put, the better, to be honest with you.
Specifically to the ambassador, or does it need to go any other direction?
Well, it's probably better if I don't talk about that in a public session. This may be one of those things that we have to go into executive session to talk about. No, I'm kidding about that. The Prime Minister of India is coming to town to meet with the President. So there are a lot of opportunities where they're looking at irritants. And this is clearly a major, major irritant. And it's important that they know that because we have pressed them. Now, from their point of view, you know, they have a different take on this.
Oh, yeah.
We press them, and our arguments are stronger when they're backed up by the United States Congress. I mean, it's just that simple. I mean, the power in Washington is right in front of me, right? So.
Okay, I appreciate it. And then a final issue I want to discuss, the one I raised with you previously, and that's Canada's Promised Utility Doctrine. It's resulted in 28 pharmaceutical patents being partially or completely invalidated, going to be a big priority for us at any NAFTA update. Any comment on those protections and that doctrine?
Ambassador, could you move a little closer to that microphone?
I'm sorry. You end up losing patents because of use, and then somebody makes a generic drug out of the same product and starts selling it. So it's a serious problem, and it's clearly something that we're going to work on. It's going to be part of this negotiation.
I appreciate it. And can you just give me the bottom line, 20 seconds, as you see this Section 232 as it pertains to steel and aluminum? I'm particularly interested in the aluminum part.
Well, I mean, I think you're going to see decisions on both of them fairly soon. I think the view in the administration is that we have a very serious issue. The President has asked us to look at these things. They had hearings on one before. They have hearings on the other today. And the President wants action. He's worried about what's happening in those industries, and the President wants action. So to the extent you have concerns about effects, it's certainly timely.
I appreciate it. I yield back. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Corbello. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador Lighthizer, for your presence here today. One issue I wanted to bring up is the effect trade agreements have on the farmers of my South Florida district. Many people not from South Florida might be surprised to know that Miami-Dade County is one of the largest ag-producing counties in the state. Most people think about our beaches, and we're very proud of those, but we also have a very robust ag industry in South Florida. We have avocados, mangoes, tomatoes, and many other specialty crops which can be grown year-round. So as we renegotiate NAFTA, which I support, I'm concerned with how the deal will affect our farmers across the country. We know a lot of farmers have benefited greatly from NAFTA. However, the story is a little bit different in South Dade. I try to spend as much time as I can with these farmers, and they have many issues that they're concerned about, immigration, taxes, but NAFTA is certainly a major one. Specialty crops like tomato, squash, eggplants, strawberries, pretty much anything that is hand-picked faces a significant disadvantage when it comes to Mexican competition. Mexico has a similar climate, and for a host of reasons can unfairly compete against many of my constituents. Ambassador, I have raised this issue multiple times as NAFTA is being renegotiated for the fair treatment of South Dade, especially these specialty crops and the farmers who grow them. I have mentioned this to you and your staff, Secretary Ross and Mr. Navarro. This issue is of critical importance to the South Dade farming community. Can you discuss what we might be able to achieve through this NAFTA renegotiation to put these South Florida farmers on a level playing field with Mexico moving forward?
Well, first of all, we appreciate your input and those of other members from Florida on this issue. We realize how important it is when we, as I said before, when we talk about how important agriculture is and the agricultural sales to Mexico, and they are extremely important. We overall have a trade deficit in agriculture with Mexico, and it's entirely because of the specialty crops, the fruits and vegetables that you're talking about. So, and there are a whole additional elements of the seasonality and the perishability. There are just a lot of things that make it a very complicated issue. And I assure you it's something that we are going to focus on in this negotiation, and hopefully we're going to get an outcome that's going to satisfy the producers in your district and in all of Florida. But it's a major problem, and you're right. It's the one, maybe not the one, but it is a major outlier in the whole agriculture story with respect to NAFTA, and it's something that I think we have to be cognizant of and try to work on. So we very much appreciate your involvement on the issue.
Well, and I appreciate your commitment, and we will continue working with you and with your office and other administration officials to try to make as much progress as possible. Another issue I'd like to briefly touch on is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Earlier this month, I joined members of the TTIP caucus, including 7 members of the Ways and Means Committee, in sending a letter to your office in support of continued TTIP negotiations. Can you talk about the positive benefits TTIP could have for our economy, especially with the inclusion of a dedicated chapter in the agreement identifying the importance of small and medium-sized enterprises?
Well, we have an ongoing reevaluation of all of our trade agreements and all of our ongoing negotiations right now at USTR. And we're looking at the benefits and the drawbacks, the trade-offs that we see. But I think that TTIP is an area where there are a lot of very positive reasons to go forward with that. It, of course, requires 2 people to be involved in a negotiation, and for a variety of reasons, largely electoral process, the European Union's not in a position to be negotiating at this point. The last election I think that they have this year is in September in Germany, and then I think at that point they'll start focusing on this. But then they have Brexit to focus on, so they have a lot of things that they have to look at too, and we also have priorities. But clearly this is a very likely potential agreement, and it was entered into because an awful lot of people saw a benefit to it. So as we go through this process, I think that we will. We'll make an analysis. We'll look at the pluses and minuses, and the views of the 7 members of the caucus that are Ways and Means Committee will be very important to us, as I should say all members.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you. Mr. Swiker, you're recognized for the final question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think last and least, or however the saying goes, trying not to repeat any of the questions, and when you're last, a lot of them have been used up. But first off, just conceptually, I have a great appreciation for how complex your world is. You have this area of authority, but everything from currencies to local national regulations to technology to infrastructure. I mean, everything ends up affecting ultimately how trade ultimately works. I do have a couple odds and ends for you. Being from Arizona, we're one of the states that if you actually look at the baseline data, NAFTA has actually helped our state's economy. But as you move towards modernization, can I beg of you to have someone on the team fixate on just customs technology, the ability to have those vegetables move across the border efficiently. The ability to say we're going to embrace a common platform for technology, and I don't care if it's based in a distributive ledger where you have GPS tags or RFIDs, and but the ability to say, how do you maximize the efficiency of those cross-border transactions and the movement of the customs?
Thank you. That is such an important question, and we've sort of touched on it in various ways, because when we talk about de minimis, there's a lot of different things, but one of the things that we are going to focus on as trade facilitation is just, and I think that the Mexicans and the Canadians will be in agreement on this, just how do we make whatever you decide your policy is, once you set it, it's got to be easier to move product and data across the border. So this is important. Efficiency is clearly our objective. Facilitating trade is our objective. There'll be technical problems, of course, but as a matter of direction, I can't imagine that the three of us would have a disagreement on that.
Well, there's that great opportunity with technology now and the ability to track a truck, a lorry, down to certification at the dock, to the movement, to the backbone that's actually that's hack-proof. I'm just embrace that technology. And the second thing, and this one may be slightly more conceptual, but as you're working on the drafting, how do you design something that's partially future-proof? If this is substantially the driver of much of the U.S. innovation and technology, what happens when that handheld supercomputer is my transmission of making purchasing decisions, or paying my fees, or moving money back and forth, that the agreement be robust enough to understand everything from the way we transmit data to where we house the data to the encryption of such data. It's that sort of that digital trade world that we're very good at, that would also make the relationships with our trading partners more efficient.
Well, I think this has to be a focus. My guess is we'll probably miss the mark, because nobody really knows what's going to happen, and it's always unpredictable. But hopefully we won't miss it by as much as the people who did it 23 years ago. We'll have the benefit of all that learning.
And that's, Mr. Messer, that's one of the great difficulties, and trust me, I'm part of a body where sometimes we commit the sin of thinking we know what the future looks like. And so how do you design at least language that as technology improvements move, the movement of, whether it be a cryptocurrency, whether it be documents of value, documents of certification, documents of ownership, that the way you've written the agreement, there aren't these great gaps that we have to wait 25 years for the next major negotiation to fill.
Well, this is so important, and hopefully we are focusing on it enough. We'll certainly try to, and then we have to build in processes, I think, within the agreement that allow you to make amendments without having to go back through the whole process when there is a sort of a huge directional change. But this is something that we're cognizant of, and we perhaps haven't thought enough about it, but certainly will, and we want to work with the Congress to do it also.
And last thing, and then transshipments, something that's actually maybe a product made in Asia, comes through a Mexican port, brought up. I'm hoping actually the same movement towards the identifications and technology can actually deal with what are products that are actually part of the NAFTA agreement and what are just those who are passing through. And with that, yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Schweikert. I'd like to thank Ambassador Lighthizer for appearing before us today. Please be advised that in addition to the questions you received here, members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Mr. Ambassador, we look forward to working with you on trade and expanding economic freedom. And with that, the committee stands adjourned.